I was nestled in the cozy corner of my favorite cafe, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee wrapping around me like a warm blanket. The soft hum of conversation and the occasional clink of cups filled the air, creating a comforting backdrop to my quiet afternoon. I'd come here to escape the chaos of my thoughts, to steal a moment of peace amid the storm that had been brewing inside me lately. My coffee sat steaming in front of me, untouched, as I stared out the window at the gray March sky, lost in my own world. Then the bell above the door jingled, pulling me out of my reverie. I glanced up and froze. Rick, my neighbor, stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway. His eyes scanned the room before landing on me, and for a split second, I saw a surprise flicker across his face. It quickly shifted to something else, something heavier, as he made his way toward my table. I straightened in my seat, forcing a smile as he approached. "Hey, Raina," he said, his voice warm but tinged with an edge I couldn't quite place. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Same," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Want to join me?" He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and slid into the seat. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. How's the weather? How's the family? But it felt like we were both dancing around something unspoken. Rick's hands fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth, and his jaw tightened as he leaned back in his chair. I could tell something was weighing on him, something more than the casual catch-up I'd anticipated. After a beat of silence, he sighed and ran a hand through his short, dark hair. "I took the afternoon off," he admitted, his tone low and deliberate. "Personal stuff. Needed a break." I nodded, swirling my spoon in my coffee just to give my hand something to do. "I get it. I've been feeling overwhelmed too. Work, life, everything. I just needed to get out of the house for a bit." He studied me for a moment, his hazel eyes narrowing slightly, like he was trying to read between the lines of what I wasn't saying. I shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, sensing the shift in the air. This wasn't going to be the light-hearted chat I'd hoped for. "There's something important we need to talk about," he said suddenly, leaning in closer. His voice dropped to a near whisper, and my heart gave a sharp thud against my ribs. I set my spoon down, bracing myself. "What is it?" I asked, though a part of me already dreaded the answer. He hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line before he spoke. "I've heard some things, Raina, about you and another guy." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught, and I stared at him wide-eyed as the cozy cafe suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. "Who told you that?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd meant it to be. Rick held up a hand, his expression softening, but still serious. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is what people are saying. This guy, Reed, right? He's charming, attentive. Everything Brad isn't lately, from what I've heard." Each word sliced through me, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. My husband, Brad, had been distant recently, buried in his work, and I'd felt the strain growing between us. But to hear Rick lay it out so bluntly, contrasting Brad with Reed, made my stomach twist into knots. "That's not fair," I said, my voice trembling. "Brad's been busy, sure, but I'd never—" "Raina," Rick interrupted gently, "I'm not here to judge you. I'm worried. You've been missing things. Family dinners, the kids' events. People notice. I've noticed." He was right, and I hated him for it. I'd been distracted, lost in my own head, letting my priorities slip. Reed had been there, too often, too close, filling the gaps with his easy smiles and quiet attention. I'd told myself it was harmless, just a friendship, but deep down, I knew better. The guilt had been gnawing at me for weeks, and now here was Rick, dragging it into the light. "Nothing's happened," I insisted, my defensiveness flaring. "I swear, Rick, it's not what you think." He didn't look convinced. "Maybe not physically," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But emotionally, come on, Raina, you're not yourself lately. And this Reed guy, he's playing on that. I've seen it before." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. Reed had a way of making me feel seen, understood, in a way Brad hadn't in months. Late-night texts, coffee runs that lingered too long. I'd let myself get pulled in, and now the truth of it was staring me in the face. My chest tightened, and I pressed my hands against the table to steady myself. "If you keep this up, Brad's gonna find out," Rick said, his tone turning grave. His eyes locked onto mine, unflinching. "And when he does, it's gonna break him. You know that." The thought of Brad, steady, dependable Brad, looking at me with hurt in his eyes made my stomach lurch. I'd never meant to betray him. Not really. But what had started as innocent conversations with Reed had spiraled into something I couldn't control, something that felt dangerously close to crossing a line. I swallowed hard, blinking back the sting of tears. "You need to end it," Rick pressed, his voice low but urgent. "This emotional affair, whatever it is, stop it now. Be honest with Brad before it's too late." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He was right, and I hated it. The weight of my choices crashed down on me, heavy and unrelenting. I'd been running from the truth, pretending I could keep everything balanced, but I couldn't. Not anymore. Rick leaned back, his expression softening slightly. "I care about you, Raina. You and Brad both. I don't want to see you throw it all away over some guy who's taking advantage of a rough patch." I nodded mutely, my throat tight. The cafe buzzed around us, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. Rick's words echoed in my head, a relentless drumbeat. Be honest with Brad. End it with Reed. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of facing Brad, made me feel sick with dread. Later that day, I found out Rick had taken matters into his own hands. He'd tracked down Reed and confronted him, warning him to stay away from me. When he told me about it over the phone, his voice was clipped protective. "I didn't do it to overstep," he said. "I just couldn't sit by and watch this guy mess with your life." I didn't know whether to thank him or yell at him. Part of me was grateful. He'd done what I hadn't had the courage to do yet. But another part bristled at the intrusion, the reminder that my mess had spilled over into someone else's hands. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. "Maybe not," he replied. "But I'd rather you be mad at me than let this go on any longer." After we hung up, I sat on my couch, staring at the blank TV screen. Rick's final words in the cafe replay in my mind. "Be the wife your husband deserves." They cut through the noise in my head, sharp and clear. I thought of Brad, his quiet strength, his unwavering trust in me, and the life we'd built together. I'd been risking it all, chasing something fleeting, something that wasn't even real. I took a deep breath and picked up my phone, my fingers trembling as I typed out a message to Reed. "We need to stop talking. This isn't right." My thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment before I pressed it, the finality of it washing over me like a cold wave. Then I set the phone down and buried my face in my hands, letting the tears come. The next step would be harder, sitting down with Brad, telling him everything, laying my mistakes bare. I didn't know how he'd react, if he'd forgive me, or if I'd already damaged us beyond repair. But I owed him the truth. I owed him the chance to decide what came next. As the evening light faded outside, I stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water with shaky hands. The house was silent, waiting for Brad to come home. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of clarity. I'd been teetering on the edge of losing everything, but maybe, just maybe, I could still pull myself back.